Right. Well, thank you for having me, Richard. And I got 30 minutes to knock this big topic off. It's not the meaning of life, but it's almost as good as. And many of you may be thinking more about the meaning of life at the moment than about the meaning of music. So a little bit of a distraction for us all. As for the meaning of life, I suppose if you ask a buttercup what it thought about the meaning of life, it would just smile up at you and say, I'm enjoying the sunshine. And that's it, chum. And I suppose that's an answer about the meaning of music. You can say just, I like it. But it's quite interesting all the same to just delve a little bit and understand what it is that we get out of it in terms of meaning and sense. So, basic bearings, I'm going to do, I hope this doesn't sound too much like a university lecture. I haven't given some in my day, but not many recently. Do my best to make it not too formal. There are 4 elements I'm going to talk about when we look at meaning in music. They're music as onomatopoeia, music as narrative, music as emotion, and music as craft. So let me give you onomatopoeia. You all are obviously, everybody over the age of 88 knows what onomatopoeic means. And, but those who are under the age might need to be remembered that it's words like bang and plop that rather suggests what they are. No mistaking a bang for a plop. So here's a little bit of onomatopoeic music. So it couldn't be anything else, could it really? Or perhaps it could be, but in fact it's la poule, la rameau. So there is the hen pecking hard into the earth and occasional cock-a-doodle-doo alongside. I wonder what you can guess this is. That's a braying monkey. And that's Hildegard telling us what a monkey sounds like. What about this one? You know that bit, the nightingale, the quail, and obviously cuckoo. So these are natural sounds. We can't mistake their meaning in that sense in the music we hear it in. If anybody knows that marvelous tone poem by Sibelius called Tapiola, not Tapioca, you know that extraordinary feeling of desolate wind in the trees, howling gale, chilly atmosphere. It is there, embedded in the music. It's the chromaticisms, it's the howl in the music that does it. When you get to a thing like Messiaen's Catalogue des Oiseaux, it's a bit more esoteric, but still, you know, it's about birds. It's sort of superficial, but it's there. It's sort of nature. But talking of those donkeys, I invite you to listen to the beginning of Hildegard's Le Petit Inde Blanc. So there we have a bit of musical painting, if you like. There's no mistaking the trot. Donkeys don't actually sound like that when they trot, literally speaking, but music trots like that, and that could be like a donkey trotting. And the occasional neigh in the right hand, and these sort of casual, nonchalant. This donkey doesn't have a care in the world. So we sort of get that. Talking of 4-footed animals. We all know that one, Earl King. That's the terrible gallop of the horse, father and son. trying to escape the claws of death, the old king who's chasing them. That's an extraordinary evocation of a gallop. Now, those are sounds that we could hear. We could almost hear the hooves on the floor there. But what about those sounds which are sort of sound repetitions of things we might see rather than hear? Sort of, what about this? Debussy, The Snow is Dancing. If snow could make a noise, it doesn't ordinarily, that's sort of how it would sound. Ibert, who was very good at lampooning all his predecessors, his French predecessors, has a little piece in the Histoire book called The Cellar of Fresh Water. And again, it's sort of liquid music, isn't it? Listen. I'll start again. And so on. That's little sort of brilliant points of light coming off the surface of the water. That's sort of picturesque in a way and understandable. And those are correlates that make the music attached to the thing it's talking about. It's sort of pretty unambiguous, I suppose, when it happens, provided we've got a title. And if you hear a clap from the orchestra, it's thunder, and it's not a leaf gently falling in the October sunshine. So, an idea very prevalent throughout music history, really. If you go back to the 17th century and well beyond, well before, there was this nature of art imitating nature, the art imitating nature, this notion called mimesis. And it's recognizable as a part of our musical experience. Art imitating nature, natural sounds, things that we're aware of out there. What about music and narrative? That's my second point. Can music tell a story? This is what Plato called diegesis. I mean, all sorts of composers do, but just from Kindersehnen, here's a little story. Here's a frightening moment. This is to say, something spooky happens. So clearly something jumping out from the bushes there. You will all know The Sorcerer's Apprentice by Dukas. Many of you will not know this wonderful piece of Marais called the Gallstone Operation. There it is. I need to be played on the bass viol. This is Marais taking us through the various horrible steps of having your gallstone removed in the early 18th century. No anaesthetic, very painful. And there are bits where he marks on the score a chill shiver as he sees the operating table and so forth. So, you know, we may tell a story in music. Kuhnau, a generation before Bach, wrote some biblical sonatas which tell stories like David and Goliath and a Strauss Don Quixote. And there are other examples of people giving us narrative. Talking about the Sorcerer's Apprentice, though, for me, it could be that you'd translate this, if you wished, into another story. It could be a Don Quixote story. This could be the knight on horseback setting forth, the deluded knight on horseback setting forth to achieve noble deeds, always thwarted, always not going right, until he's finally persuaded to dream his last days away. So one might think of these programs being a bit sort of transportable. This sort of music, though, is called program music, as we know, but it's, you know, it gives music meaning. Let's just go a little bit deeper into this. Let's see whether we can give a fantasia of Mozart a little bit of meaning in this sense. You'll all know this. Sorry, replayed it. Now, that is the gloomy grandfather. He reminisces a bit for earlier nostalgic days. And then his daughter arrives to do some housework, which is a good sign. And here she is dusting some dust off the mantelpiece. And something a little sinister hangs in the air. She'd forgotten to turn the tap off in the bathroom, and all the water's coming through the ceiling. Well, is that a fair sort of take on this Mozart fantasia? Could we really begin to think it's our job to associate those moments with that sort of narrative? Or could it just be that there are contrasting states of mind? Some are gloomy, some are more optimistic, then we're swept away by events which we can't control. Difficult to think that a narrative can work unless really the composer tells us first what it is. And therefore music of its own doesn't really have the power to make one narrative, to express one thing, does it? It reminds me of Stravinsky's inflammatory remark, music is powerless to express anything. You can see what he means. I mean, it's polyvalent, as the French would say. And if we can't, with a piece of narrative, have a collective understanding, we're rather stuck because we don't have any common ground. So I think narrative is a secondary order thing in musical creation, as indeed is those onomatopoeic creations. You have to remember that composers who did attach programs to the music were inclined to withdraw them afterwards. Berlioz famously gave us a program for the Symphonie Fantastique and then said, oh no, there's no symphony, there's no narrative attached to this whatsoever. And Sibelius is not so much guilty as prone to suggesting a narrative to some of his symphonies and afterwards to refute the notion there was any narrative. But it needn't only be a narrative, it can actually be a scene, if you like, a tableau. Here's a tableau. Here's another one, in the same key. Nearly. Of course, Moonlight. What is it about those pieces that says something about moonlight? Does it? Moonlight. What it says is distance, veiled mystery, still contemplation, and sort of moonlight is one context in which that might occur. Here is Schumann in some moonlight. And find it there down. It's actually called Träumerei, dreaming, reverie. But it's the same thing, isn't it? It's a sort of idea of quiet contemplation. So those scenes can be part of a sort of narrative type. And we need to get that as well. That's part of meaning in music. If we stir this all into our experience of music, we can see that things standing outside music then can sort of add their quality to our listening. But for centuries, the unlocking of understanding, the unlocking of the meaning of music was actually vocal music. And opera, of course, because here indisputably there is a text, and the text tells you what it means. Hooray, mission accomplished. The manner in which composers have responded to text has led some writers to actually propose that there is a language of music. This is the title of a book by Derek Cook, where by unpacking vocal music and looking at the intervals that they're used and the various gestures employed, he sort of suggests that there is a way in which a composer may impart a meaning in purely instrumental environments. Funeral marches will always be in a minor key. I recall that he has very great difficulty, does Derek Cook, with the Dead March in Saul, you know, the funeral march at the end of Saul, which happens to be in C major, annoyingly. So we can't, you know, be altogether certain this is going to work. And the phenomenon of a contrafactor, you know, when a piece of vocal music is taken and a new set of words given it, tends to sort of blow his theory out of the water. Jauchzet frohlocket is the first chorus of the Bach Christmas Oratorio. Exactly the same music is used for secular cantata, ihr Pauken, beat your drums, or tune your, you know, sound your drums, it means. And they're not the same, it's not the same meaning, it's different. You might say there's associations there, but it's not the same meaning in the sense that it's closely defined by the text. The earliest day from the B minor Mass is in fact a contrafactum of a aria from an earlier cantata, obviously earlier, Ach, bleibe doch. So there's sort of different meanings if we're defining them by the text. But you understand every time, I guess, you open a piece of music to sing that the text is imparting a meaning to the music in one sense, because the text is there, and composers will be going out of their way to find modes of expression which fit the words, if you're lucky. So previous generations always thought that instrumental music could only be understood if you compared it to vocal models. This was a long-held orthodoxy in musical theory. It's actually still behind the row in the 19th century between Hanslick and the Wagnerites. Hanslick was an absolutist. He believes in sort of the abstract qualities of music. So for him, the Brahms style, the Brahms symphonies are the sort of high point in art where music speaks for itself. It doesn't need any translation. people who were more inclined to see Wagner as the savior of modern music thought that was utterly implausible, that music, in fact, was so closely conjoined to words that the two couldn't exist without each other. Well, that's music and narrative. What about music as emotion? This is something, of course, that we're all aware of. But let's think about our emotional states. How many do you have and how many could you knock off? Maybe you're happy, sad, triumphant, despairing, jealous, world-weary, magnanimous, peaceful, etc., etc. There are various ways you could describe your state of mind. I wonder whether you could actually name 150 without getting stuck. Maybe you could, but you couldn't name 200. And it's difficult to think that music's business is to tick all those off. I mean, Mozart wrote 600 pieces of a huge corpus of music. Are we saying that corpus of music simply addresses itself to some known emotional states? That can't be a satisfactory answer. There's another question. When you listen to a piece of music, do you ever feel jealous or angry or compassionate or magnanimous? Does that actually happen? I think it's doubtful. It's unlikely that music can convey those particular states of mind by itself. Even with words, that might be tricky. So we may recall Stravinsky's words, music is powerless to express anything. Handel simplified this, of course, greatly in his oratorio, Allegro, il penseroso ed il moderato. He's thought there were two states. Basically, you were happy or you were sad. And there were varying degrees of these, and the best place to be was in the middle, moderato. How simple life would be. So, emotion in music is pretty tricky. Let's just recap where we are. I identified three ways in which music conveys meaning. It can convey a sound that we hear in the world outside, in the natural world. That's a fairly sort of superficial level. It can tell a story, it can have a narrative, that goes a bit deeper. It can transmit an emotional charge, that's for sure. But I suggest that the last thing is pretty undefined unless clarified by the composer in words, in a title. We know there is a lot of emotion in music, but can we really put our finger on it? Perhaps Mendelssohn was right when he said that the problem is, or the great thing perhaps he meant about music, is not that it's too imprecise for words, exactly the opposite. It's too precise for words. It gets to the heart of the matter where words fail. That actually comes very close to an 18th century theorist called Bateux, who was trying to deal with this imitation of art theory and sort of cracking up a bit because it creaks, and said, well, in fact, you know, the thing is we may not be able to name many of these feelings that we have. 1,001 ideas and feelings may be given to us through the music, and it's sufficient to know that we've received it, not important to name it. And that's a way, in a way, ducking the issue, but also recognizing that these feelings are there. But also saying that music cannot be a language conveying a literal meaning. It's much more suggestive, elusive, and therefore perhaps powerful. And part of its power, of course, lies in its raw materials. This can get to our psyche in a very immediate way. A pounding beat will hit our stomach. A shrill alarm will hurt our ears. Complex orchestral scores play on those raw materials that take us to deep places in our psyche. So musicians, composers at least, deal with that physical world and deal with the raw materials that music has to offer at various levels of sophistication, whether it's meatloaf or Bach. And then finally, we have music as craft. And here the idea is purely, and I rather like that adjective or adverb, I should say, and simply that music has its own vocab, grammar, and syntax. anything that I previously said about music's power to associate with nature, to be a narrative, to convey emotional states, actually falls on its knees before craft, before music as its own language. Susanne Langer, the philosopher, was very good when I think she said she concluded that everything in music needed to enter the musical matrix. In other words, the internal logic and coherence of music. That's its meaning. So it's okay hearing the donkeys braying, but donkeys have to bray musically. Here's an example of what we might mean about music having its own language and its own coherence, and therefore its own meaning. Well, I could harmonize that. I could do this. Still logical. I could do. Doesn't make any sense. So 3 different harmonizations, 2 of them plausible, the last completely implausible, because demands a certain sort of treatment, not any old treatment. So there is a correct way, there is a grammar, there is a logic in music, and the composer, therefore, perhaps, this is my crux, is delighting us by the way he or she manages that language, its own internal coherence and logic. It's not to say all those other things aren't there, but they are, it is to say that they surround it. They're not the intrinsic element. Surprisingly, as it might seem, that the emotional drift of a piece is not the intrinsic quality of the music you're listening to. So when we go back to Bach's Sculpted Variations, we go back to it because we're amazed and delighted by every third variation being a canon at some different interval. We're just overwhelmed by Bach's counterpoint, not his cleverness, but it is just his craft. And for me personally, those craft moments are when I can be most deeply moved. It may seem to you that I'm a lost cause when I say to you, when I hear in a fugue, a marvelous augmentation moment. I can think of that moment. I've not quite got it. The C minor fugue from the second book of the. Do I mean the first book? That's the other one. It has a wonderful augmentation towards the end, which I find deeply moving, and I just also find that stretto fugue. It's very exciting and moving the way the stretto condense. And I'm all with Burney here. Charles Burney wanted to refute the notion that de Fontenelle was putting about, the 18th century French philosopher, that music always had to be about something. De Fontenelle said, wishing to smack down the abstract nature of Italian music at the time, he said, sonate come veux-tu? Sonata, what are you wanting? You know, I can't understand what you're trying to say. And Burney said, well, that's an idiotic question. It's not the one to ask. Burney said, listen to the ingenuity of the composition, the neatness of the execution, the sweetness of the melody, the richness of the harmony, all polished into passion. That's what he was hearing. And that's what I hear. That, I think, is the meaning of music. So there we are. If not the meaning of life, then the meaning of music. So that's 30 minutes on mail.
Thank you, Edward. Thank you. I've got lots of questions, but I won't hog the situation. Could we have some questions from other people before I ask my slightly tricky ones? You need to unmute yourselves. Okay, I'll start. So when I left school, Edward, and I was one of the last resident students at the Royal School of Church Music. There was a wonderful library in there, and at night I would go in and I get out the Helmut Walker Art of Fugue recording, and every night I would play it between about sort of 10:30 and midnight. So this is an hour and a half of Bach's Art of Fugue. This is music which most people would regard as inaccessible. To me, it was absolutely wonderful, and I got such a tremendous buzz out of this. I mean, it was a visceral thing. It wasn't just an intellectual thing. So what do you think I was sensing from that at the age of 18?
Well, because of your repeated listenings, you were imbibing his craft. You may even have thought about it a little more closely by looking at the music on the page. But craft can speak for itself. The Van Eyck altarpiece in Ghent, recently restored, shows you just what the power of craft is. It's not simply the image that counts, it's the way it's done. A dazzling brilliance, technical brilliance, just sort of beyond anybody's human capacity. And one's in all of it. You know that wonderful story about the musical offering. Bach improvised it at, was it Potsdam? It's certainly the palace of Frederick the Great, because C.P. Bach, his son, of course, had invited him there. And the Emperor Frederick thought he would just test Bach out. So, you know, it was a theme given or presented, and Bach performed it in 2 parts, and they went to another room for another harpsichord, and then he gave a 3-part improvisation, fugal improvisation, went to another room, and it was suggested that 4 parts might be a good idea. He got as far as 5, gave 5, and then for the 6th he said, "Your Majesty, I will send that one to you in the post." And I can absolutely understand that. But when you're in front of somebody who has that capacity to handle the materials with that degree of skill and sophistication, and it's so difficult, it's, you know, it's really beyond most people's comprehension that it's possible, then you are in front of something that's extraordinarily beautiful. Something from the human hand that defies the normal laws of gravity. So that's very moving. It brings tears to the eyes, and you're drawn back to it again and again and again. That's why one almost always must put in front of people, young and old, the things that are most seriously beautiful, because in their company, you begin to understand what beauty is.
Thank you. Thank you. Do you think that any of these points are cultural in a sort of nationalistic sense? A lot of your examples were French. Do you think that when we talk about the meaning of music, that we are pre-programmed by our nationality and our culture?
Yes, in a sense we are, as in so many ways. You know, what side of the road do we drive on? It's dangerous to do it in another way. I think that enculturation is obviously generational. It comes by being in a place and a time and being exposed to particular sorts of music. In a global village, of course, one's exposure is very generalized. And one of the things that we now experience quite clearly is a much more global view. We're much more adept at sort of getting into the other groove. At the same time, I really seriously doubt that we get as deep in the groove as somebody who's never left it. So there's always a price to pay. It's like when you think about orchestral sounds, if you go back 2 generations, you hear a French orchestra, the woodwind, oboes and bassoons in particular, sound so French because they are French. Nobody has those instruments but the French. Now, of course, instruments and players now move around the world. It's become a global industry, performance in orchestras. And that specific colour of a French orchestra is lost, doesn't exist anymore. The Swiss Romande orchestra doesn't sound as it used to. So your cultural groove matters a lot, but it's no longer as deep as it used to be.
Yeah, good. Last question from me. I've heard you taking rehearsals, and one of the things I'm interested in listening to people's rehearsals is not the music, but the comments they make to the group. And you have a certain repertoire of things to say to your performers, which reflects the points you've made today. Are you aware of this? Are they aware of it? How does this work in terms of your relationship with your choir or your orchestra?
Oh, that's pretty impossible for me to tell because it's at some level that I'm not aware of. I will say at the level when I was talking to choristers, so youngsters, I was determined that they understood as far as they could what actually was going on in music. So I would sort of, if we were doing Tavern of the Lamb, I'd point out there was a sort of mirror image at work there. And they would get that. If we were doing piece of 16th century music with Cantus Firmus, they would understand that there was a bit of the scaffolding in it. They'd understand about imitative entries, they would understand about harmony, they'd understand about dramatic events in music, because I would tell them, I would sort of invite them to consider it. So I'm talking there about the craft, aren't I suppose? I'm saying, you know, get to grips with this craft. Basically, it's anything you've got, because everything else depends on it. If you don't understand the craft, you won't really understand the music. You may say that condemns the amateur listener. I don't think it does, because there are ways in which we understand craft without us knowing it, really. You know, I think the things that are ineffable in music count for more. That's why it's best at some point to stop talking about it.
Bridget, have you got any points?
Sorry, is that better? Yes, following on from your fascinating talks about music and narrative and music and emotion, I was just thinking of the colour of the keys in terms of 18th century tuning systems and different temperaments that we use, obviously, you know, following on from the earlier medieval modes. But in terms of your performances and performances today, how do you feel they affect your performances? In terms of theorists like Matheson and others, if they're saying, you know, C major is a key of battle, or do you think this affects any of your performances in terms of key structures?
It's a very nice question. The relationship that the composer has with his ideas or her ideas and the key is the first thing that happens, isn't it? The composer is thinking in terms that relate to that key. So whether the key has particular tuning or not, because the tunings were diverse at the time we're talking about, 18th century, maybe, you couldn't be sure that C major would always sound exactly the same, but you could be sure that in C major, a composer would have a certain sort of attitude and a certain approach. There were certain sorts of music that would go with C major. And so the association is very clear. People talk about it. Charpentier, you remember, of course, gives a list of key associations, and they, I think, profoundly affect what the composer, the key the composer chooses. When it comes to performance, I think you've got it all set up, really. It is quite demanding in a large ensemble to do very refined tuning. On a keyboard, of course, you can set up, you know, sixth comma or mean tone and have something extraordinary which really pulls the music around. So Luigi Rossi in a chromatic toccata sounds like nothing on earth compared with equal temperament, and that's a great sound, but that's revelatory. So there can be moments there where you can control it because you can control the keyboard tuning. there are other moments in performance when you can invite everybody to stop playing their major thirds so high, and that will make a difference. But I think when you're in front of 40 people, it gets less and less controllable, and the fit-all Vivaldi comes into play. That's what happens.
Yes.
We all play to Vivaldi, and that's it. And the fifths are slightly tempered, as well as the thirds, of course.
Vivaldi is a compromised temperament.
It works, yes.
Yes, that
Yes.
works. And I use it in girls' class performances when we're doing Baroque stuff. They probably don't even know it, but it's the thirds are not so sharp, and the music just has a more relaxed feel and works better. And that's the sort of compromise we have to use today, because we do skip around from different periods. We perform modern music, old music, medieval music, opera, jazz, with the whole thing, and these all got different feels to them. And of course, the more of these different styles we get our heads around, of course, the more diluted our grip of it becomes. But it's still worth doing, I think. One other question, Edward. I was speaking to a very cultured Quaker who went to a very cultured Quaker meeting house, where they did things like having, instead of course, they don't have talking, which I think is always quite nice. They have things like a string quartet playing. And so their idea of devotion and worship, things which most religions would associate very strongly with words and would deny was impossible without words. These are felt in the Quaker situation just by listening to the music in a seemingly abstract way, but in fact a very devotional way. Do you have any thoughts on that?
This is the way the concert hall becomes the sort of the sacred space.
Yes.
And indeed the sacred space can become the concert hall. It's these sort of disassociations one might be inclined to make between the sacred and the secular are not useful. I mean, sometimes, of course, they make us feel uncomfortable because something is so secular in its connotation that we don't really feel comfortable with it in another context. But Bach, of course, as you know, shifted his idiom freely from one sphere to the other. So the notion that we can think of music as sort of spiritual, I think is entirely valid. I hesitate to say that that's its purpose, because that would begin to make it a vehicle for some other thing, and I don't think it is. But I think it can bring us to a place where we feel more aware of the things that can't be said, but which are nevertheless there and profoundly true.
Thank you. Yes. Let's have some questions. Daisy, give us a question.
Richard, I think there are some questions in the chat section.
Can we wear hazmat suits? From Elizabeth McShane. Which questions are these?
No questions at the end of the chat.
Yeah, there are a couple.
Yes, some nice thank yous, Edward. Okay, this is a perfectly valid question. Desert Island Discs, Edward, you're the guest. We haven't got time for the whole program. Which disc are you going to save from the waves?
Yeah. Well, the answer must be something that repays repeated listening. You've got to come back to it time and time again. So it had to be something long and complex, but can be deeply mined. So on one level I might say, give me Debussy Fête. I think it's wonderful. I found it entirely exhilarating. I thank Huyula's daughter, Sibelius, fantastic piece. I'd just die for it. But I know that on the 20th reading, it wouldn't be the same. So it would probably have to be like you. It would probably have to be Art of Fugue.
Yes, yes. I get embarrassed by this question. People say, what's your favorite piece of music? And I feel I must be a very strange person because my favorite piece of music changes quite frequently. I'm not saying I don't have one. I'm saying I have one at a particular time, and then I get interested in something else. And this attitude, I think, is reflective of the sort of work we do in choir, in that my views develop and change. And quite often, I find myself learning from my students. Roderick Williams has taught me so much. You know, I taught him when he was 6, and now I learned so much from him. Colin Good, the jazz pianist, has taught me a lot of stuff. I also taught him when he was little. And this is my way of thinking about music. So it's not all coming from me, or it's a sort of interactive thing. And so I always look at things in a different way. And I sometimes will go out for a country walk, and if there's a blackbird singing, I'll just sit down and listen to it for ages. I suppose that's the sort of thing that Messiaen did, but I'm not claiming that this is anything special or intellectual or profound. It's just deeply associative with being alive. And I think that's one of the things that Edward's been talking about this morning. Do we have some more questions here? I'd quite like to increase the sort of bandwidth for this discussion.
I think there's a question on the chat about which contemporary composers do you rate?
Good one.
Yes, I asked that.
Yeah, I'm going to duck that one. I mean, I don't need to have an answer in a way. I do spend a lot of my time with music which is not of my age, and if you were to ask me what I regret, but I'm not going to beat myself over the head about, is that I don't live as one might have lived in past generations. I don't live in my own time in one sense, do I? If I did, I would listen to a lot of contemporary music. I would listen perhaps only to contemporary music. And I'd have a much better answer to your question. I would have an answer, in fact. But I don't have an answer. I'll tell you what I don't particularly like, though, if that's a useful answer, what I don't like. I don't like minimalism. It gets on my nerves. So Philip Glass, Reich is a different matter because it's rather fascinating the way the clockwork works, but I don't get Glass. So I want my music to be going somewhere. And I don't like music which is clearly incompetent. There's quite a lot of that around, actually, modern music. Not very well written. Because I think, and here, this is a bit inflammatory, I think quite a lot of composers who've come up now, and I'm just talking about some of them, not all of them, but quite a lot of them have not had a very sort of rigorous training in craft. They've been invited to let it all hang out, which is sort of all right. But in fact, it does them a disservice because they don't get used to how very disciplined and how crafty they can be. So there, you have a rather tangential answer, and one I hope doesn't sound dismissive of modern composers, but that's sort of my experience.
I think as a composer, I'm inclined to agree with most of those things. What do you think about, and in the way this relates to your lecture anyway, complexity? You know, you've just talked about minimalism, but thinking on the sort of other end of the, contemporary music spectrum, I wonder how you feel about sort of craft and complexity. Of course, that word works on lots of levels.
Yeah, Fernihoe and co.
Yes.
It requires a very special sort of listening, a very special sort of study. I'm not opposed in a way to what it has to offer. There are some ways in which you might count Messiaen in with this, because when he gets deeply attached to his durations at a level where you can't possibly understand them, I can't at least, as an oral experience. I can only but appreciate them as a sort of a way he's got to where he's got on the page. I have to say that there are bits about the compositional process that are become irrelevant. They might have been very relevant to the composer, but become irrelevant to me. So when listening to a highly complex piece of music, say by Brian Fernyhough, I might be saying to myself, this sounds rather lovely and beautiful, but I don't need to know about how he got to where he's got. Now that may put a hold under the waterline as regards my saying, let's know about craft. But I think there are ways in which one can receive music as long as you are clear about it. And there are some musics you might say, well, look, I don't really know what's going on, but I listen happily enough to it, and I sense that something is going on. And if I had time, I'd try to find out more about it. And then it's a matter of where you put your time and energy, isn't it?
Thank you.
So, yeah, highly complex things can be received simply.
Yeah, but can I ask, from your experience as a music tutor, why you think a lot of modern composition is so weak? Is it the process? Is it the fact that quite often, I think for GCSE music, you know, the teachers are told they mustn't give their students much help. It has to be entirely original work. And I for the life of me, can't understand how people can produce original art of any description without training. Yeah.
Well, I agree. You understand, of course, the career experiences of composers of previous generations. They were often highly proficient in their teens. They've been taught as part of maybe a family dedicated to music. Either the Bach family would be one instance, but there are many others. Mozart is another instance of people who acquired prodigious talent and competence, before they were 12. And that sort of matters. And it's a competence that comes of actually doing what music does as you hear it around you. You're not trying to be novel, you're just sort of copycatting away. And it teaches you the trade. And at a point, because we're in this funny Western environment where there's a law of diminishing returns. It's not true of other cultural environments like the Far East. It's not wholly untrue of the Far East, but Chinese music, for instance, greatly admires and supports music which doesn't change, from one generation to another. It's the classical idiom that we retain. In the West, we've always wanted things to be different. We've always put a huge price on novelty. So at some point, the composer has to become novel in our culture. But we have allowed the composer to be novel before they've actually learnt the craft. I think we've put that particular cart before the horse, which is sort of one way of understanding what may have gone a bit awry. There's some people who cope with that. There are others who remain perpetually benighted, who don't know what craft is as a result of never having been taught it before they were 21. But what you say about teaching elements or teaching environments is so true. The customer, the client, provider relationship now, which is supposed to exist in universities, is pernicious, because after a good tutorial, you want to be able to say to your student, well, thank you very much, I've learned a lot. And that's actually not a client-provider relationship as it's known commercially, where the provider, me, the tutor, provides everything the client wants. It's very distinctive. It's an interchange of ideas, exchange of ideas. So another sort of rather malign influence in our own time, the commercialization of teaching, to be avoided at all costs if one can.
12:57. Can we have one question from one of our younger participants? Speak up.
There are some questions in the chat, I think.
In the chat. So one from you. When you start programming a concert season or putting together a music list, where do you start? Where does this, what does this process look like for you as it develops?
Right, okay. If I want to get to sleep, I start preparing a music list. And I can get quite some way down it. And I, of course, come the morning, I've forgotten half of it, but at least I retain some of it. So there is a process of just imagining. Actually, this may interest you. In the sense that a music list for a chapel choir at New College is a very special thing to compile, because at one level, it has to go with the seasons, the calendar. That's fine. At another level, it has to go with the seasons of work in the songroom and in the chapel. For instance, you never want to put two difficult pieces back to back. You always want in a week to have something you repeat in order to have that experience of comfortably going into the same warm bath water. You always want to have something which is straightforward and easy, that they can almost sight read. You've got to sort of flex their work pattern. So it always has moments of relaxation and moments of harder graft. Moments of complexity, moments of simplicity. So you're looking for a variety of repertory and a variety of types of work that will make the environment more efficient, more productive. And I'm very much aware of that. That you sort of pick things off the shelf in your mind, your virtual shelf, with the idea that's going to assist in that approach.
Yes. And no one would have more experience of that than you, I think, having worked with generations of people. And I mean, you will know that sometimes one year your choir is very strong, another year you've lost 4 good boys at the top end, and it's sudden. It's what was quite easy last year it needs a bit more work from everybody.
Yeah, that's true, but also, you know, it seldom drops below beta double plus, and the intriguing thing is that if you do, we did the St. John Passion once every other year. And in a group of 16 boys over 4 age groups, there are only 8 of them who can really do it.
Yes.
Top 2 years. But the bottom 2 years are sort of running behind, catching up, sort of seeing what they can do. The very bottom year just opening their mouths in time with the music. In 2 years' time, those bottom 2 years are the top 2 years. And miraculously, they can do it. Not because they've done it before in the proper sense, but because they were there when it was done.
Yes. And that of course, is the special way that cathedral choirs work. And this is reflected in where you position the boys within the group, isn't it? So that you've got leaders and corner boys and this sort of thing, so that...
you spread them out.
Yes, yes. Good. Okay, 1 minute past 1. Any other questions?
Pep's asked if you like jazz.
I love it. I think it's great. I mean, I'm more Miles Davis than, you know, the more modern stuff, but I think it's an extraordinary idiom and so rich in competence, and of course rich in improvisatory skill. That's where we hear so little improvisation from classical, inverted commas, musicians, where it was previously just part and parcel of your makeup. You know, Mozart would improvise sonatas at the piano, Beethoven would do the same, Bach obviously would improvise fugues, and it's just those French organists these days who improvise symphonies, organ symphonies, and they're very, very good at it, and they're still trained to do it. And I think the improvisation part of jazz is just so wonderful to behold. But the idiom I find entrancing as well, just sort of richness of it, and the sort of sheer joie de vivre often that it conveys.
Do you think that arises from spontaneity, or do you think it arises from a very well-mastered set of improvisatory skills?
Both.
Both. Do you think the same, can I just ask this question, do you think the same applies to Bach? So if you went to church in Leipzig and Bach was playing, do you think that he wouldn't have been playing one of the well-known organ pieces that you and I know? He would have actually been improvising a prelude and fugue.
Yes, I think he would, and as often as not. And the way you do that, of course, is to have tricks up your sleeve, things that work. And that's the way they were taught. They were taught how to sort of combine their counterpoint. That was how, it goes back a long way that. I mean, very few people may know that one of the skills you needed in certain parts of Europe, in Spain, it's certainly true, was the ability as a maestro di cappella, was the ability to improvise an additional part in a motet. There's a set of requirements for the application process of the direction of music at Toledo Cathedral, early 17th century, where one of the tests is to improvise a fifth part against four being sung. Now you can only do that if you know the way the cards stack up, you know the way this sort of works. It's sort of Rubik's Cube sort of thing. And you can get the hang of it, and they did. And it seems, again, to us, just how could they do that? How could they know what's coming up next? They did. So when you talk about improvisation, it's a skill set. These sort of things work, and then it's ideas which flash across the mind as they play.
And that's what you hear in jazz, of course, isn't it?
Exactly that.
Yes. Yeah. I'm reminded of the story of a pupil turned up to Vidor's house for a lesson, and or was it Dupre's house, and his wife said, he'll be with you shortly. He's practicing his improvisation for tomorrow morning.
Yes. I think we've all done that. Yeah.
Thank you very much. A very interesting discussion and interesting questions. So next week it's Roddy in the psychiatrist chair. So I await this with bated ears. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Edward.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.